I can't believe what I'm hearing.
I wasn't used to letting anyone control me. I didn't take orders, limits, much less a no. Until I walked into Veludo and met Kason Vasari, the mob boss confined to a wheelchair, looking at me like I was already his. He proposed marriage. I laughed in his face. I said I'd never marry a broken man, but Kason didn't take no for an answer, just like me. And it was simple. Either I wore his ring, or my family lost everything. I accepted the contract, but I swore I'd never be a real wife, until our wedding night, when he pinned me against the wall and whispered, "You think I can't do this? I'm still a man." Maybe I should have understood right then that telling Kason Vasari no was provoking the most dangerous man in Chicago, and that every provocation would have consequences. Hi, I'm Lena. A special shout out to those of you watching Book 1 for free here on the My Stories platform, completely ad-free and uninterrupted. Chapter 1, The Queen, Without a Crown and the Car on the Curve. The first thing I heard that Friday was the porcelain hitting the tray with more delicacy than it deserved. The second was my own voice slicing through the silence of the bedroom like a poorly sharpened blade. "Renata, the coffee is cold." The housekeeper stopped at the threshold. I knew, without looking, that she'd tightened her grip on the tray handle with that restrained force of women who learned, at some point in life, that holding your tongue is safer than holding your ground. The smell of coffee rose from the cup in a vertical thread, still steaming, and the steam gave me away before she could answer. "Miss Whitmore, the coffee was just served. I know when coffee is cold. I'm a Whitmore. Too lukewarm for this house. Too lukewarm for this cup. Too lukewarm for my mouth. Take it away." She picked up the tray without answering. The faint clink of the spoon against the porcelain followed me until the door closed. I rolled over in the canopy bed, pulled the sheet up to my chin, and closed my eyes as if sleep were a courtesy I granted myself. Noon in Chicago, and the light from the window slipped through the gap in the heavy curtain with the impertinence of things no one can tame. It was the kind of morning I hated, not because of the morning, because of the idea that there was a world out there waiting for me to be someone, when I was already everything I needed to be without lifting a finger. I got up half an hour later. My feet sank into the Persian silk rug my mother insisted on replacing every winter, as if swapping out a rug were the same as swapping out a life. I came down the penthouse staircase with my silk robe slipping off my shoulders, and stopped in the living room with the calculated care of someone stepping onto a stage. The smell of white lilies came from the arrangement on the entryway console. Lilies were my mother's favorite flower, and she had them replaced every Tuesday, as if the house needed the smell of a church to put up with me. My mother was on the couch, wearing that ash-gray cardigan I hated, holding a cup that trembled slightly between her fingers. It always trembled. I think her hand had gotten used to trembling around me. "Meredith, darling," she said quietly, "I'd appreciate it if you wouldn't treat Renata that way. She's been with us for 15 years. She's been with your husband for 15 years, Mom. With me, she's been here for 23. I was born in this house. I think I know what I'm asking for." My mother set the cup down. Her movement had the slowness of someone who had rehearsed it in the mirror all night. The porcelain touched the saucer with a faint click, and it was almost as if the whole house had stopped breathing to hear what came next. "I'd like, just once, for you to look at me and see a woman, not a piece of furniture." I laughed. The laugh came out before the thought, as always. "Mom, a woman is what you refuse to be when you let Dad choose even the shade of your lipstick. Don't ask me for respect over something you never fought to have." I saw her jaw tighten. I saw her hand start trembling again. I didn't feel anything. That was the problem, I think. I didn't feel anything in the moment. Things came later, in trickles, at strange hours of the early morning, when I could no longer tell whether I was regretful or just bored of myself. That was when my father appeared in the archway of the room. Ottavio Whitmore wore his usual suit, an unlit cigar between his fingers, the expression of a man who negotiated hotel chains before breakfast and fired managers before lunch. With me, he had a single tone, the tone of exhausted patience. "Meredith, to the office. Good morning to you too, Dad. Now." I followed him down the hallway with my robe still half open, barefoot, because I knew it irritated him. The runner muffled my footsteps, and the cold marble in the gap between one rug and the next reminded me, every 10 feet, that this house had never been made for bare feet. In the office, he sat behind the mahogany desk and opened a folder with the calm of a man about to chop off a head. The smell of the unlit cigar mixed with the leather of the armchairs and the whiskey he'd had the night before. The the smell of a man who decides. $480,000 on a 3-day trip to Saint-Tropez, without telling me. You took 6 friends on a chartered jet, rented a villa that belongs to a sheikh, and drank champagne equivalent to the annual salary of one of my managers. I brought Mom perfume. Meredith, what do you want, Dad? You want me to apologize? Fine. Sorry. Can I go back to sleep now? He closed the folder. He looked up. And he said the thing I wasn't expecting to hear, with the calm of someone spitting into a crystal glass. The card is cut off as of noon. It's past noon. You're cut off. I blinked. I felt the robe go cold on my shoulders. Not from the air, from the sentence. You can't do this. I can do anything, daughter. That's the problem with this family. I could do anything for 23 years. And what I did was give you everything. I'm tired of being a rich man raising a queen without a crown. A queen without a crown? I laughed. Loud. And the laugh came out cracked. Dad, you owe everything you have to the very last name I carry. Whitmore isn't you. Whitmore is what you became after you married my mother and used her grandfather's money to open the first hotel. Don't try to teach me who runs this house. He didn't answer. He just looked at me for a long second, the way parents look at their children when they understand, too late, that they failed somewhere specific along the way and no longer know how to go back. There was a pause in which I heard, with absurd clarity, the pendulum clock in the corner of the office mark the second, the next, and one more. I walked out, slamming the door. I climbed the stairs 2 at a time, my heart pounding more from anger than effort. In my room, I grabbed my phone and dialed Sienna's number without even looking at the screen. Babe, my dad cut me off. Sienna Halverson laughed on the other end, with that laugh that was half cackle and half pity. Mir, that man cuts you off once a month since you turned 16. Tomorrow he'll give the card back with flowers. I hung up. I threw the phone on the bed and stared at the penthouse ceiling with anger buzzing in my teeth. I didn't know, that afternoon, that 3 weeks later, a black marble staircase would change the rest of my life. On the other side of Chicago, the unwanted heir of the Vasari Cosa Nostra was sitting in his father's office. I, naturally, didn't know that. I had never heard the Vasari name spoken out loud, only murmured, at my father's business dinners, like the kind of name you pronounce with your mouth closed. But the story happened, and it happened without me, and I have to tell it the way it was told to me afterward. Cason Vasari, 30 years old, held a low ball of whiskey in the Veluto's private booth and pretended to listen to his father. The booth smelled of cured tobacco, and the dark wood of the velvet curtain, and the low light from the sconce carved the Don's face into the shadows of an old portrait. Don Severino Vasari, on the other side of the small booth table, recited the ultimatum the way a man says the rosary. You take command before the end of the year, or I pass the ring to your cousin. You choose, Cason. But I won't die and leave this family in the hands of a man who prefers women and whiskey to blood. Cason laughed. It was a short laugh, low, the way he laughed at the things that really hurt. Dad, I was born to design houses, not to order men killed. You were born Vasari. The rest is a whim. Then the whim stays. He stood up. He grabbed his car keys from the entryway tray, a brushed silver tray where 3 generations of Vasaris had already dropped the keys to everything they drove, from cars, to companies, to men. Tomas Drago, the right-hand man who had been with him since he was 19, leaned against the door with his arms crossed. Boss, let me drive. Tomas, I had 2 fingers, not 2 liters. Boss, I said I'm driving. Tomas lowered his eyes. Tomas always lowered his eyes when he knew he was going to have to clean up whatever came next. Cason walked out the door of the Vasari mansion with his usual stride, the stride he would never have again that way. The car left the property's driveway at 11 p.m. The Chicago air that night was biting, with that smell of wet asphalt the city has even when it isn't raining. The curve toward the interstate was 4 kilometers away. Cason took it at 60 over the limit. The headlights of a truck were coming in the wrong lane, or he came in the wrong lane of the truck. Afterward, nobody could say for sure, and nobody asked out loud. The car flipped 3 times before stopping on the shoulder. What he told me afterward, in fragments, was little. That he came to upside down, held by the seatbelt, and that the first thing he thought wasn't fear, it was relief. There. Now he leaves me alone. It was the only sentence he gave me whole from that night. Months later, when I'd already earned the right to ask. The rest I reconstructed over time, piecing together what Tomas let slip and what Don Severino never said. That he woke up at Memorial Hospital 3 hours later, with his father beside the bed, a doctor talking about nerves and edema, and the certainty, looking at his own feet under the sheet, that he'd already made half the diagnosis himself. Possibly temporary, the doctor said. Maybe permanent. The next 6 months will tell. Severino waited for the doctor to leave. He didn't say anything for a long time. When he spoke quietly. Now you take over. Kaysen turned his face to his father. He had a cut on his eyebrow, dry sweat in his hair, and the steady eyes of a man who'd lost his legs but not his tongue. No, Dad. I'm not going to sit on your throne. Not with legs, not without them. Pass it to my cousin. Severino stood. He took his overcoat from the back of the chair. He stopped at the door, and he left without answering. The silence he left in the room, I was told later, was the loudest sound of Kaysen Vasari's life. And meanwhile, in that same minute, on the other side of the city, I was coming down the Veludo staircase laughing at some joke of Siena's, with no idea that 3 weeks later that same staircase would hand me over to a man who didn't yet know how to move his legs, and who, even so, had already decided I was going to be his. Chapter 2. The Silver Dress on the Veludo Staircase. 3 weeks is enough time for a body to mend a rib, close a cut on an eyebrow, and get a girl like me used to the idea that driving fast isn't the only way to run from a father. It isn't, however, enough time to erase a fight. That afternoon's fight had been about the usual nothing. Ottavio shouted in the library. I shouted louder in the hallway, and the housekeeper pretended not to hear while she gathered crystal glasses with the care of someone who, in 20 years in the house, had learned not to make noise at the wrong time. I walked out slamming my bedroom door with the exact violence needed to make the staircase chandelier tremble, a trick I'd perfected at 15 and never abandoned. Wear something he'll hate, Sienna said, crossing the closet barefoot, a half-empty glass in her hand. Preferably expensive, preferably silver. Silver is vulgar. Silver is a threat. She tossed the dress onto the bed. I looked at it with the face of someone who had already decided to wear it before she'd even spoken. It was short, glittering, the kind that walks into a room before the woman wearing it does. The fabric caught the lamplight and threw it back in shards against the wall. I sighed. Veluto. Tonight. Now. I told my parents I was going to bed early. You said you were going to bed early at your godfather's funeral, and you ended up in his pool by morning. Put that on and come down. Sienna Halverson, 24 years old, my best friend since Milan, author of 90% of the bad ideas in my life, and the only person authorized to call me everything my mother never managed to. She dressed in black, because she believed that a woman in black next to a woman in silver was a duo nobody forgot. We went down to the penthouse garage without running into Ottavio. A small happiness, but enough. The driver opened the door. Sienna got in first, commenting that my father's new car smelled like a man with something to hide. I laughed without paying attention. Later, much later, on a kitchen step, with a coffee cooling between my hands, I would remember that sentence as if the universe itself had whispered it. Veludo sits on an unmarked street, behind a facade that passes for an art gallery. The line outside lasts hours for mere mortals. For me, it lasts as long as it takes the bouncer to recognize me and move the velvet rope. Sienna lifted her chin. I didn't lift mine. I never needed to. Walking into Veluto always had the same ritual. Narrow corridor, walls covered in dark leather with the sweet smell of beeswax and old cigar smoke trapped in the fabric, and then the double door that opens onto the interior black marble staircase. The staircase is the centerpiece of the place. Whoever walks down it, walks down being seen. I walked down being seen. I felt every step under my heels, the silver fabric shifting against my thigh, the heat from the dance floor rising up my legs. The music thumped in my chest in a low cadence, as if the place had a heart of its own. Sienna walked one step behind, on purpose, because she knew exactly what she was doing by leaving me framed alone against the railing. It was on the third step that I felt it. I didn't see it first. I felt it. It's hard to explain to anyone who has never walked into a room knowing they belong to it. There's a weight in the air when someone looks at you the wrong way. It's not the gaze of a salon's desire, of a married businessman, of a middling heir. That doesn't weigh. That only suffocates. The weight I'm talking about is something else. It's the gaze of someone who decided something about you before you even arrived. I lifted my head. The Veluto mezzanine sits suspended to the left as you come down, with a matte iron railing that separates the Don's box from the rest of the mortals. That was where he used to drink, when he still drank standing up. I didn't know that at the time. I didn't know his name, didn't know about the Vasari Cosa Nostra, didn't know that whole ports in Chicago obeyed the man who in that instant was returning my gaze from above. I only knew that he was sitting, in a wheelchair, and he didn't look away. For a second, My breathing changed rhythm without asking permission. I held his gaze because I don't know any other way to respond to someone who stares at me. He didn't blink. He didn't smile. He didn't raise his glass in greeting, the way men in a room do when they want to say, "I saw you." He simply looked, the same way someone looks at a piece of property in a window before signing the check. I felt anger first. Anger is my oldest defense. "Babe," Sienna whispered beside me, stepping down the last step. "The guy in the chair won't take his eyes off you." I saw. Seriously, he doesn't blink. That's mildly concerning. It's mildly irritating. Oh no. She took a long sip. "Babe, either he's in love, or he's appraising you for an auction." Honestly, in both cases I thought it was hot. I laughed without meaning to. It was the first thing he saw of me after the silver. The laugh. I can't say what that did to his face, because his face didn't change. But the hand holding the glass, I swear, tightened. "I'm going to ignore him," I said. "You're terrible at ignoring." "I'm great at ignoring." "You're great at pretending you're ignoring." We crossed the dance floor. I kept my head high, the curve of my back at the exact angle Milan had taught me. An angle that says, "I'm not looking for you," and simultaneously, "You'll find me." What no one told me at the time is that this angle only works on men who need to be convinced. Against a man who has already decided, the angle works against you. We went up to our usual reserved table. Champagne on ice, 2 crystal glasses, the amber light that turns any skin into magazine skin. Sienna signaled a server and asked for more ice, because for Sienna life always needs more ice. I sat facing the mezzanine, on purpose. From there I could see the man in the chair at the same time I was pretending not to. A tall redhead, in a discreet green dress that was too obvious to be only functional, crossed the mezzanine with the familiarity of someone who'd worked there too long to need to ask. She stopped beside him and said something low, near his ear, without touching him. He nodded. She swapped his glass for another, fuller one, without looking at the liquid. She did everything with the economy of motion of someone who had done it 1,000 times. Somewhere in my brain, I filed the redhead under the one who runs the place. I didn't think anything more of it. Women like her exist in every VIP club in Chicago. I turned back to Sienna. I smiled at a congressman passing nearby. I refused 2 drinks. I refused a third. I drank my own because I don't drink anything any man offers. "He's still looking," Sienna informed me. "I know. You're not looking. I know. You're looking, but through the reflection of the ice bucket. Sienna, I'm just observing that you've become creative." I got up. I decided to dance, because dancing, when you know you're being watched, is the equivalent of saying, "Look again then." The Veludo floor that night was packed, stifling with the heat of bodies pressed together, and the expensive perfume that mingles with sweat, and turns into something almost animal. I cleared a path with my hand raised and my glass balanced, and I danced a little with Sienna, a little alone, a little with the whole night. It wasn't for him. I swore in that moment, and I swear it again now that it wasn't for him. Lie. It was for him. It was for every man who had ever dared to look at me that way, that decides before asking. When I came back to the table, I raised my glass toward the mezzanine. I held the gesture a second longer than necessary. I smiled with my teeth, the smile my mother always called cold, and that I always called mine. "Take that then. Look, see if you can handle it." He raised his glass back, not slowly, not quickly. He just raised it, tilted his head slightly, and went back to drinking without looking away. I felt a shiver I decided to blame on the air conditioning. "Babe," Sienna said, serious for the first time that night. "Who is that?" "No idea." "You don't ask?" "I don't ask about men in wheelchairs at VIP clubs. Asking sounds like charity." She looked at me with a new heaviness in her face. "Do you hear yourself when you talk?" "Religiously." "Well, I hear you too, and you worry me." I spun the glass between my fingers, feeling the cold crystal resist the heat of my hand. I didn't answer, because the truth, which I wouldn't say even under threat, was that something in my chest had gone out of tune 3 steps back and still hadn't come back into key. I called it irritation. It was easier to call it irritation. I decided to leave before dawn, which for me has always been synonymous with leaving early. Sienna protested, pouted, eventually gave in because she knew that arguing with me about leaving was arguing with the door. We went back up the stairs. I made a point of not looking at the mezzanine on the way up. I refused to give him the satisfaction of watching me climb the same path I had come down. Sienna looked for me, and I knew she had looked, and she knew I knew. "He's still watching," she said, when we reached the double door. "Let him watch. Meredith, let him watch, Sienna." Already in the car, with my head against the seat and my heels thrown on the floor, I let the driver take the avenue that hugs the lake. Chicago at that hour has a false calm that has always pleased me. Lights on and empty windows, traffic lights blinking for no one, the windshield fogged by the cold that was starting to drift down from the lake. Sienna got out first at her building. She kissed my cheek with the forced lightness of someone who wanted to ask one more time and didn't. I went up alone to the penthouse. Bare feet on the cold floor, the silver dress laid out over the bedroom chair like a discarded suit of armor. I took off my makeup slowly. I washed my face. I looked at the woman in the mirror and said quietly, "Good night, princess," the way my mother used to say when I still let her call me that. It was when I lay down that the thought crossed my mind. It crossed quickly, without warning, the way dangerous thoughts always cross. That man on the mezzanine hadn't looked away once. Not when the redhead swapped his glass. Not when the congressman passed near my table. Not when I raised my glass in mockery. Not when I climbed the stairs with my back to him. Men look. I know how men look. I grew up being looked at, appraised, talked about at tables where I hadn't even been invited to sit. But that kind of look, the look of someone who has decided, I had never encountered. I encountered it at 23, on a black marble step, in a dress Sienna picked out to piss off my father. I closed my eyes. I pulled the sheet up to my chin. I told myself out loud that I wouldn't think about him anymore. I didn't know his name. I didn't know that he already knew mine. I didn't know that. The next morning, before I'd even woken up to the coffee my housekeeper would serve at the wrong hour, a black armored car would pull up in front of my father's penthouse, and that inside that car would be a man who had spent the entire night on the Voluto mezzanine deciding, in absolute silence, that I would be the only thing he still wanted from that city. I slept with the nightstand light on. I dreamed of black marble. I dreamed of a glass raised in slow motion. I dreamed of a matte iron chair that rolled soundlessly through the halls of a house I hadn't yet seen, but that smelled, in the dream, like the same dark leather of the Voluto entrance. And I woke up, at some point in the early morning, with the exact, absurd impression that someone, somewhere in Chicago, still hadn't looked away. Chapter 3. A Father's Hurry. The next morning at the Vasari mansion dawned with that Chicago gray that seemed to swallow the light before it even reached the ground. I wasn't there, of course. I was sleeping at my father's penthouse, on the other side of the city, with no idea that at that instant, my name was being placed on a mahogany table, between a half-empty bottle of whiskey and a clean crystal ashtray. I learned later, in time, how it had gone. Kaysen told me in fragments, over months, and my father filled in the rest reluctantly. But that morning I woke up the way I always did, sprawled across the sheet, hair messy on purpose, my phone buzzing with messages I had no intention of answering. The last thing on my mind was the word marriage. The first thing on my father's mind, at that very hour, was exactly that. Tomas opened the office door and announced my father's name without expression. Ottavio Whitmore. "Send him in," Kaysen said. Kaysen didn't rise from the chair. I learned later that he could, by that morning, transfer his weight to his arms and stand by gripping the edge of the desk, but no one knew that yet, and he preferred my father to see him like this, sitting, calm, in no hurry. Ottavio walked in wearing a dark suit, gray tie, the professional handshake that masked the man who had called me at 3 a.m, 3 years earlier, to discuss the first installment on the security firm. We already had history. We already had trust. And trust, in a world like mine, is rarer than blood. The office still smelled of the previous night's cigar, mixed with the coffee Tomas had brought at 5. The fireplace was out, but the wood of the console held a dry warmth that set the tone for the conversation before it had even begun. "Kaysen," he said, sitting down without waiting for an invitation. "You called me at 6 a.m. I came with pajamas under my suit. I believed you." He laughed dryly, accepted the whiskey Tomas served without needing to be asked. I let the silence happen for as long as it needed to happen. I had learned from my father that hurry is the first thing that gives a man away. "Your daughter," I said, finally. "Meredith." I saw his glass stop halfway to his mouth. I saw, for a fraction of a second, something cross his face that I couldn't name in the moment. Then he set the glass back on the table, slowly, and the crystal touched the wood with a low sound that seemed louder than it was. "What about her?" "I saw her at Voluto yesterday." "She was at Voluto?" "In a silver dress, laughing loudly, drinking too much." Ottavio closed his eyes for a second. When he opened them, something in him had given way. Not much, just enough for me to notice. "Kaysen, I can't hold that girl anymore. I cut her card off yesterday. She spent almost $500,000 on a flight to Saint-Tropez without telling me. She humiliates her mother, Quezon. Humiliates her, as if it were a birthright. I want her hand. Otavio slowly lifted his eyes. I held those eyes. I didn't blink. Quezon, I want your daughter, and we both know you're in no position to tell me no. He was silent. He looked at my chair, not with pity, with calculation. Otavio is one of my kind. In that cold way businessmen recognize other businessmen. You want her as a wife in name only, he said carefully. Or as a real wife. As a wife. Quezon, she'll eat you alive. I know. She's cruel. I know. You're in a wheelchair. For now. Otavio kept looking at me. I let him look. I was 30 years old, carried the heaviest last name in Chicago, and sat in a chair that hadn't yet decided whether it would let me stand again. And even so, the firmest thing in that office was my will. I need to think, he said. You don't. Quezon, Otavio, you've needed an answer for your daughter since she was 13. I'm offering you that answer. Think as long as you want, but I know what you're going to say. He drank the whiskey down in one go, set the glass down, looked at the wall, looked at me. The gray light from the window hit his face and showed for a second the exhaustion he hid better than he hid the cigars. When? 10 days. 10? Prenup. 2 copies. Discreet ceremony at the chapel here. You sign as a witness. Otavio breathed, and then he accepted. Fast. Too fast for a father. Too fast for a man who had just heard that his only daughter was going to marry a mafioso in a wheelchair within 10 days. Too fast. And he realized it himself, and tried to cover it up, standing to shake my hand with the formality of a partner, not the tremor of a father. But I noticed. I filed it away without knowing what I was filing. Just the small record that my father had shaken his hand too quickly for a father. It was Saturday afternoon when my father had me summoned. I was at the penthouse pool, sunglasses on, white bikini, my wet hair dripping down my back. Sienna had slept over at my place and was doing her toenails beside me, in no rush, commenting on someone's dress at a party neither of us had gone to the night before. The weak Chicago sun crossed the terrace glass without warming anything. The housekeeper appeared at the edge of the pool, with the face of someone who already knew she was about to get yelled at. Your father asked for you to come to the office. Tell him I'm busy. He said you were to come now. I took off the sunglasses, looked at her. Sienna stopped painting the nail on her right foot. The housekeeper didn't lower her eyes, and that bothered me more than the message. There was something different in that house that afternoon, and I couldn't read it. Fine, I said, standing up. Tell him I'm on my way. I went up with the towel wrapped around my body, chose the most provocative outfit I could find in the closet, short denim shorts, a white cotton blouse with no bra, and dried my hair quickly, just enough that it would drip on the way. If he wanted a serious conversation, he was going to have one with the daughter he raised. My father's office was on the upper floor of the penthouse, in a hallway that always smelled of Cuban cigars, even though he swore he'd quit. The door was open. He was standing with his back to me, looking out the window that faced the lake. He didn't turn when I walked in. Sit, Meredith. I'd rather stand. Sit. His voice had a weight I didn't recognize. I sat, in one of the English leather chairs he'd bought at an auction in London years ago. I crossed my legs. I waited. The leather was cold against my thighs, still damp from the pool, and the cold rose up before the conversation did. He turned. He looked at me the way someone looks at a decision already made. You're getting married. I laughed. I didn't even fake it out of politeness. I laughed loudly, from the throat, head thrown back. It was the most ridiculous thing I had heard in 23 years of life. I'm what? You're getting married. In 10 days. At the chapel of the Vasari mansion. Dad, stop joking. I'm in a good mood today, don't ruin it. Quezon Vasari asked for your hand yesterday morning. I accepted. I stopped laughing. Not all at once. It came down in layers. First the smile, then the chin, then the shoulder, which suddenly understood that there was a chill there. Quezon Vasari. The name reached me unattached, faceless. Vasari I knew. The family. The ports. Veluto. Quezon I had never seen, or thought I had never seen, until the memory of the previous night came up slowly. The mezzanine, the man up high in the wheelchair, the glass I had raised in mockery without knowing for whom. Him. Dad, I said, and my voice came out lower than I wanted. You're telling me you promised your only daughter to a cripple. Don't talk like that. To a cripple, Dad. A man in a wheelchair, who I saw 2 nights ago, from across the Veluto mezzanine, looking at me like I was a horse. Meredith. Never. Are you hearing me? Never. I don't marry broken men. He looked at me the way he looked at the chessboard on Sundays with my uncle, without anger, with calculation. You don't have a choice. I always have a choice. Not today. My father opened the drawer. He took out a folder. He crossed the desk and pushed it toward me. I didn't open it. I looked at his name on the cover, in worn gold lettering, and I felt that thing I didn't recognize rise up my spine, a kind of fear that wasn't fear of an animal or of heights. It was the fear of not being able to hold the tone of my voice. "Open it," he said. I opened it. They were contracts. For the hotel chain, for the investment portfolio of my last name. In every one of them, beside my father's name, appeared another name, in recent signature, in firm black ink. Vasari, Vasari, Vasari. As if his ink had learned the way to my father's ink without needing to ask permission. What is this? Movements from the past week. Dad? What does he have to do with your hotels? He came in, as a minority partner, for now. You sold part of our company to the Cosa Nostra? I didn't sell. I gave up a stake in exchange for me. My father didn't answer, and that silence answered for him. I squeezed the folder between my fingers. I felt my nails digging into the leather, the rigid corner of the cover pressing into the soft flesh of my palm. I looked at my father, this man I had humiliated 1,000 times at 1,000 dinners, this man who had cut off my card on Thursday as if that meant anything, and I realized for the first time in my life that he held cards I didn't know about. If I refuse, I said slowly, what happens? He's already moving the hotel contracts like chess pieces, Meredith. In a month, it turns to dust. In 2, I don't have a house to take you back to. You're blackmailing me with your own bankruptcy. I'm offering you the only man in this city still capable of telling you no. I was speechless. Not because I didn't have an answer. I had 1,000. But any of them would have come out with a tremor in my voice. And I swore to myself, in that second, that the man in the wheelchair, all the way across Chicago, would never see me tremble. All right, I said, and my voice came out flat, icy, rehearsed in 0.3 of a second. I'll marry him, but I swear one thing to you, Dad. I'll be ice until the last day, and when that man dies in the bed you're pushing me into, I'll be the one signing the funeral papers. He looked at me for a long time. He didn't answer. His eyes had that calm of someone who had counted on my answer before I myself knew what it would be. I got up, left without saying goodbye. On the way down the hallway, I heard his low voice behind the door, speaking on the phone. It's done. And something inside me turned into what I now know to recognize as the first piece of woman. Sienna was in the car, sunglasses on, the air conditioning at maximum, her sweet perfume filling the closed space as if nothing of what had just happened upstairs could be real. She looked at my face, at the folder under my arm, at the way I closed the door without slamming it. Mare, she said, what's with that face? I'm getting married. To whom? Kaysen Vasari. It took her 3 seconds to understand. When she did, she opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again, and true to who she always was, she chose the worst possible comment to make in that exact moment. Babe, then we need to start thinking about the dress. Black, right? Matches the chair. I looked at her, and I laughed. A dry, short laugh that hurt in my throat as if it were crying. Because it was. I just didn't know how to cry yet. Chapter 4. The I Do to the Ceiling. 10 days later, I walked into the chapel of the Vasari mansion alone. No veil, no bouquet, no father walking me down the aisle, because I had forbidden it. No music, because I had forbidden it. The dress was white, simple, by my Milan stylist, chosen in 2 hours over the phone with the exact instruction, something that doesn't look like a wedding dress. What came out of that was a milk-colored silk tunic that fell straight to my ankles, and that was the most beautiful thing I had ever worn. Exactly the opposite of what I wanted. The chapel was small, high ceiling, light stone, 12 people maximum. Don Severino Vasari in the first pew, black suit, expressionless eyes. My father 2 pews back, beside my mother, who was crying quietly into a handkerchief. Sienna beside her, navy blue dress, the face of someone who still didn't believe what she was watching. Tomas Drago standing by the side door, hands crossed in front of his body. A priest I didn't know. And him. Kaysen was at the front of the altar, in the wheelchair. A perfect black suit, dark tie, hair combed back, clean-shaven, hands resting in his lap, calm, like someone waiting for coffee. When he saw me come in, he didn't smile. He just followed me with his eyes from the door to the altar step, and it was a gaze that entered my skin and stayed there. I had known the desire of men long before that day. This was something else. This was patient possession. I decided on the 4th step that I would humiliate him, not with words, with gestures. The priest addressed me with the usual questions. and I answered them all looking at the exact point where the chapel ceiling met the back wall, behind him. I didn't look at Kaysen once. When the I do came, I said, loud and clear to the ceiling, I do. I felt, more than I saw, his smile appear. It wasn't a groom's smile. It was the smile of someone who recognizes an opponent and likes what he recognizes. The papers came next, 2 copies of the prenup, on a small wooden sideboard that Tomas brought without a sound. I signed without reading. Kaysen signed slowly, with a dark fountain pen, and his handwriting was that of a man who had learned calligraphy in childhood and never forgotten. At the end, the priest said the sentence I knew was coming, and that I had planned to answer with distance. But Kaysen rolled the chair closer, took my hand without asking, and lifted it to his lips. Kissed my fingers, slowly, looking at me from under his lashes, and didn't let go. It was the first time he had touched me, and I swear, forgot to breathe for a whole second. The toast in the mansion's event hall was quick. Don Severino said 3 dry sentences in Italian that I understood from start to finish, and pretended not to understand. Something about family, about name, about duty. Old capos looked at me as if measuring a heifer at a fair. I held every gaze with a smile of ice. My father didn't look at me once. My mother hugged me at the door and whispered, "Take care of her." And I didn't know whether she was talking about me or to me. Sienna disappeared with a flute of champagne toward the garden, escaping what she herself had called the best produced funeral in Chicago. Tomas led me through the corridors to what he called, in 2 words, the bridal suite. It was the old east wing of the mansion, a huge bedroom with windows facing the garden and a closet the size of my entire old room, wide queen bed, white sheets, a side door to Kaysen's room, open, another to the bathroom, closed. "Does Madame need anything?" Tomas asked. "For you to leave." He left. I locked the closet door from the inside. I leaned against the wood. I breathed. For the first time that whole afternoon, I let the tremor reach my knees. That was when I heard the chair in the bedroom. Slowly. Rubber tires over the rug. It stopped in front of the closet door. Silence. "Meredith." His voice was low. It wasn't the tone from before. It was intimate, without permission to be intimate. "Open the door." "No." "Open it." I said no. The handle turned. I had pulled the door shut, not locked. I discovered too late that the closet door didn't lock from the inside. It only simulated the lock. He laughed, a short, dry laugh with no joy. He pushed. The door opened inward. I had my back to it and turned around slowly. Kaysen looked at me from the chair, and his face was without mockery, without smile, without pity. He was serious like a man who had come to collect something he knew was his. "Come out of the closet." "No." He rolled the chair inside. The closet was large, but not that large. He came within 1/2 meter of me and stopped. He raised his hand, slowly, and held my wrist. He didn't squeeze. He just held. And there, in that touch of firm fingers on the thin skin of my wrist, I understood for the first time that that man in the chair had more strength in his forearm than half the men I had ever known on their feet. He pulled me gently. I took a step toward him without meaning to. He pulled again. I took another. And then, with an ease that frightened me, he brought me in front of his chair, and with the other hand at my waist, he turned me. I felt my calves bump against his footrests, and pressed me against the mirrored wall at the back of the closet. The dark stone of the mirror chilled my back through the silk. His knee was between mine. His hand had moved from my wrist to my elbow. The other was spread open at my waist. And his face was inches from mine, so close that I could smell the whiskey he had drunk at the toast, and the citrus soap he used after shaving. "Look at me," he said. I didn't. "Look at me, Meredith." I looked, and regretted it the next second, because his eyes were dark and deep and calm the way the sea is calm before it pulls you under. "You think I can't want you like this?" he said, low, very low. I'm still a man. The air went out of me all at once. It wasn't the sentence. It was how he said it, without a wound, without irony, with the cold certainty of someone stating a fact. "Let me go," I said, and my voice didn't come out firm. "I'm not holding you." And he wasn't. His hands were braced against the wall, one on each side of my head. I could have ducked out from under his arm at any moment. It was my will that was cornered, not my body. I felt then something that made me furious, because it was the last thing I wanted to feel in that closet, on that afternoon, on the wedding night of a marriage I had accepted by blackmail. I felt attraction, deep, animal, as old as the world, for the mouth of that man, 3 centimeters from mine. Kaysen noticed. I saw his eyes drop to my mouth, come back to my eyes, and I realized he had seen it too. And even so, he didn't do what any other man would have done in that second. He drew back, slowly, rolled the chair back, a hand's width, 2, 3, kept his eyes on mine. "I will never take from you what you don't give me," he said. "But the day you give it, Meredith, I'll collect it all at once." He left the closet, closed the door behind him without slamming it. I collapsed sitting on the closet floor, leaning against the mirrored wall, and trembled for 5 minutes without crying. I couldn't cry. I just trembled. I slept right there, curled up on the thick rug, the wedding dress crumpled between my thighs. I woke up the next morning with a stiff neck and the gray Chicago light coming through the crack of the half-open door. Someone, at some point in the night, had laid a blanket over my shoulders and left without making a sound. I didn't have to ask who. I got up, folded the blanket on the closet bench, and made, sitting there on the wooden floor, the first decision of my adult life. If he had decided to play patience, I was going to play Cold War. The following days, I secretly called the campaign. I refused breakfast in bed on the first day. I asked for juice and spit it back out. On the second, I swapped his medication schedules with the precision of someone who had learned pharmacology on Google in 2 hours. The anti-inflammatory became nighttime. The muscle relaxant became morning. The one that was supposed to be taken on an empty stomach I had served after lunch. Cason noticed on Thursday. He didn't say a word. He simply called the nurse, put everything back in its place, and looked at me at dinner with a calm that left me worse off than if he had shouted. On the third day, I sent flowers to Luca Bertinelli, an ex of mine from Milan I hadn't spoken to in 2 years. White lilies, card in my handwriting, missing what we could have been. I asked them to be delivered to the Vasari Mansion gatehouse by address mistake, knowing that 2 security men would read it before the flower got near the staircase. That night, Cason called me to the office. I went in a silk robe, barefoot, because I wanted to provoke. His office was on the ground floor, near the garden. Walls of dark wood, an open window onto the shrubs, a half-empty bottle of whiskey on the sideboard. He was with his back to me in the chair looking at some papers on the desk. He didn't turn when I walked in. "Sit, Meredith. I'd rather stand." I said sit. I sat. His voice had something different. It wasn't the closet voice. It wasn't the altar voice. It was the voice of a man who had 20-some armed men under his name, and who, for the first time that week, reminded me that I knew it. He turned the chair toward me, rested his hands on the armrests, looked at me. "I'm going to tell you this once, and only once," he said, and every word fell with weight. "On my side, you have the world. Cars, clothes, travel, time, friends, peace, everything. No ceiling. Against me, you discover what the Cosa Nostra does to its enemies. And enemies, Meredith, I've already buried enough of to not be impressed by the size of your father's name. Choose." I didn't answer. I couldn't. My mouth had gone dry inside. "The flowers for the Italian," he went on, and Luca's name came off his lips as if he had known it for years. "Arrived at his place this afternoon, along with an envelope. Luca will not come looking for you again. Not by text. Not in a dream. You'll never hear his name again. You don't have the right to... I have the ring on your finger, Meredith. I have every right." I looked at my hand. The ring was there. I hadn't even remembered to take it off when I lay down. "The medications," he said. I let slide. It was amusing, on the level of a child swapping the salt for the sugar in the bowl. "But if I find your hand meddling with anything that's going into my body again, Meredith, we're going to have a conversation you're not ready to have yet. Is that clear?" "It's clear." "Look at me." I looked. "I'm not the drunk boy from the mezzanine, Meredith. That boy crashed his car on a curve 3 weeks before he saw you. The man who married you last Thursday is somebody else. Take your time figuring out who he is. I prefer it that way." I stood up. My legs obeyed by some miracle. I made it to the door. Before leaving, I turned my head. "Are you done?" I asked, and my voice came out firmer than I expected. He smiled, small, for the first time that night. For today, I left. I walked down the hallway with the most rehearsed calm of my life. I went up the stairs. I went into my room. I locked the door. I pressed my forehead against the cold wood, and for the first time since the chapel afternoon, I understood, with absolute clarity, that there was a man behind the party boy of the mezzanine. A whole man, wheelchair or on his feet. It didn't make the slightest difference. And the most frightening thing wasn't him knowing that. It was me, with my forehead pressed to the door of my own bedroom in his house, having begun to want to find out. Chapter 5. Stand Up, Vasari. Wednesday's early morning began with a sound that shouldn't have existed in that house. I was in my room, across the hallway that separated the two suites of the east wing of the Vasari mansion, when the thud crossed the door. It wasn't loud. It was worse. It was muffled, like the sound of something heavy that tried to fall silently and couldn't. I sat up in bed. The sheets slid away. For 2 seconds, I pretended I hadn't heard. Then I got up. I crossed the hallway barefoot, the thick rug swallowing the sound of my feet, and stopped in front of his door. It was ajar. The bathroom light, on, spilled through the gap like a warning. I pushed gently, and the whole room received me in silence. The empty bed, the wheelchair tipped on its side, the white pajamas crumpled on the floor like a crime scene clue. Case on. No answer. I crossed the room to the bathroom and saw him. He was on the marble floor, between the shower and the sink, propped on one elbow, the pajama shirt open at his chest, the sweat shining at his collarbone, his hair fallen over his eyes. He was trying to lift himself by his own arms, and his arms trembled with an effort that had no answer left. When he saw me, he froze. His face hardened at once. Wounded pride disguised as anger. "Get out of here," he said low. "Get out of here now, Whitmore." It was the last name he used when he wanted to push me away. Whenever he went back to Whitmore, it was to remind me that I wasn't yet truly Vasari. I didn't leave. I closed the door behind me. "Where are the nurses?" I asked. "I dismissed them." "All three?" "All three." I knelt down. The marble was cold against my knees, and he looked away when I came close, as if my face 1/2 meter from his were one more humiliation. I could have said something. I could have laughed, mocked him, thrown back at him every week in which he'd held me by the wrist and called me a spoiled child. It was the perfect moment. I didn't do any of that. I slipped his arm around the back of my neck, fit my hand into his side and lifted him. He was heavy. He was a 30-year-old man with muscle that hadn't forgotten how to be muscle, and I wasn't strong. But that early morning I was, because it was the only thing I had to offer, and because, for the first time in weeks, he needed me without asking. I sat him on the edge of the bathtub. He stayed there, elbow on his knee, hand on his forehead, breathing like a man who had just finished running. "Why did you dismiss them?" I asked quietly. "Because I don't need an audience to fall. You need hands. It's not the same thing." He lifted his eyes to me. There was no anger there. There was something else. Something I had never seen on that face, and that, if I had thought about it for 2 seconds longer, I would have called by its right name. "Why are you helping me, Meredith?" The full name. No Whitmore, no Vasari, just Meredith. I swallowed hard, because someone has to. It wasn't the true answer. The true one I still didn't know how to form. He nodded once. I held out my hand. He took it, and I helped him to the chair in silence, without hurry, as if the cold marble between us had turned, in those 10 minutes, into the most intimate place in that whole house. I left the room without saying goodnight, but I closed the door carefully. It was from there that dinners changed. Before, I ate alone in the suite. He ate in the office. The mahogany table in the main dining room sat set for 2, and no one sat at it, a daily irony the housekeeper avoided commenting on. The night after the bathroom, I came down. He was already there, at the head, and when he saw me at the door, he simply pointed with his chin at the chair at the other end. "Going to stand?" "I'm thinking. Think sitting. It's less tiring." I sat. Dinner was almost silent. Almost. On the 3rd night, he asked what I had studied in Milan. I answered, "Italian literature, 2 years, dropped out." He asked why. I said poetry was useless. He laughed, a short, surprised laugh. "Who told you that?" "My father." "Your father knows hotels, not Montale." I looked up from my plate. He had cited Montale. Cason Vasari, heir to the Cosa Nostra, whiskey drinker, partier until collapse, had cited Eugenio Montale on a Tuesday night, fork in hand, without expecting applause. "You read poetry?" I asked. "I read what falls into my hand." I didn't believe him, but I filed it away. It was on a Thursday that I discovered the rest. I passed by his office to drop off an envelope the driver had asked me to deliver, and the bottom drawer of the desk was open a finger's width. I shouldn't have looked. I did. Architectural plans, on tracing paper, folded in thirds, with firm handwriting in the corners. Wide veranda, 16-foot ceiling, sea in the background, stone house. It wasn't Chicago. It was a place that didn't exist yet. I closed the drawer. I didn't say anything at dinner. But that night, while he drank his late-night whiskey in the office, I stopped at the door and said, "The veranda should be bigger." He looked at me over the glass. He didn't ask how I knew. He just smiled. A smile that wasn't for me. It was for the drawer, and that even so hit me whole. It was in that same week that he discovered my notebook. I was reading in the garden, behind the rhododendrons, on a stone bench no one used. Quezon appeared in the chair, pushed by Tomas, and Tomas stepped away with the discretion of someone who had been pretending to be invisible for years. Quezon rolled up to where I was. I closed the book too late. Pessoa? He said, reading the author's name on the cover. Pessoa. Heteronyms? All of them. He held out his hand. I hesitated. I handed it over. He flipped through slowly, stopped at a marked page, read in silence, and gave it back without comment. You read poetry in secret, he said. You design houses in secret. We exchanged a look. It was the first pact between us. Silent, without contract, without witness, without veil. Each one knew the other's secret, and neither of us was going to tell. Physical therapy was my idea. I pushed the chair to the room they had set up on the ground floor, with the parallel bars and the rubber platform, and told the physical therapist he could go have a coffee. The man hesitated. Quezon laughed. Go, she's worse than you. And he was. I fought with him at every session. When he gave up on the 4th try, I shouted. When he called me spoiled, I answered that he was lazy. When he threw the towel on the floor, I picked the towel up and handed it back. Stand up, Vasari. I can't. Stand up. Meredith, stand up, Vasari. And he stood up, trembled, sweated, cursed in Italian, thinking I wouldn't understand. I understood, and stood up. Then he fell, and I was there when he fell, and I was there when he rose again. The phone vibrated in the pocket of my robe that morning. Sienna, 3rd call of the week. I looked at the screen and didn't answer. I put the phone away, and the guilt of not answering settled 1 second lighter than it should have. One afternoon, after a session in which he took 3 steps in a row, before collapsing onto the bars, I sat in front of him on the platform, our breathing tangled together, and I did the most idiotic thing of my life. I leaned in. I kissed him. It was a light kiss, quick, with no promise. My lips barely touched his, and even so I felt everything. His sweat, his heat, the still air between the 2 bodies. He didn't respond. He didn't pull me. He didn't do anything. He just closed his eyes for a second, and when he opened them, he murmured, low, against my mouth. Again, I got up. I left the room without answering. I crossed the hallway with my legs trembling more than his had trembled on the bars, and I locked myself in the suite and pressed my forehead against the door and swore to myself that I would never do that again. I swore badly. I swore knowing I was lying. That night, I didn't come down for dinner. He came up. He stopped the chair at my door. I heard the low creak of the metal handle and stood there for a whole minute without knocking. I stayed on the other side of the wood without breathing. When he rolled back down the hallway, I slid down the door to the floor and stayed there until dawn, with my mouth still buzzing from a kiss that hadn't lasted 3 seconds, and that had lasted, I now knew, the entire week. The next morning, he waited for me at breakfast with the newspaper open. He didn't comment. He just looked at me over the cup, once, and his gaze had again written in every letter. I looked away, but it took me a while to look away. The capo's dinner was set for Friday. It was a routine meeting. Don Severino sat at the head. 3 old capos of the Vasari Cosa Nostra took the sides. Gioele Marchetti, the consigliere, sat to the Don's right, and Quezon was at the other head, in the chair, commanding a table that still had men who referred to him in Italian as the young one on wheels. I shouldn't have been there. Women don't sit at capos meetings. I walked in anyway. With the wine tray. Permettete? I asked at the door, in Italian, and the 3 capos turned around with that surprise men of that type can never quite hide. Don Severino raised an eyebrow. Quezon didn't raise anything. He just watched me from across the table with the calm of someone who had understood, the second I stepped into the room, that something was going to happen, and that he was going to like it. I started with the Don. I poured slowly. I smiled. Then Gioele. Then each capo, in order, the old man with the mustache, the thin one with small eyes, and the thick signet ring on his pinky, who was Bevilacqua, and the third one, quieter, without rushing, listening to the conversation that had already started up again in Italian, because they assumed once more that I didn't understand. Il giovane sulla sedia non firma più niente da solo, said the one on my left, a man in his 50s with an old-fashioned mustache. Adesso firma con la mogliettina americana che gli serve il vino. The young one in the chair doesn't sign anything by himself anymore. Now he signs with the little American wife who serves him wine. The other 2 laughed quietly. The third, thin, small-eyed, with the thick signet ring on his pinky, added, Il porto perde 4% al mese da quando lui non scende più. Qualcuno ci guadagna. The port loses 4% a month since he stopped going down there. Someone's profiting. I stopped pouring. I set the bottle down slowly on the sideboard. I walked to the head of the table where Kaysen sat, picked up his empty glass, and filled it halfway, the exact halfway that a man who knows how to drink asks for. I gave the glass back. He didn't take his eyes off my face. Don Severino, I said, turning toward the other end, in impeccable Italian that Milan had taught me 5 years before. Permettet, una parola, prima del brindisi. The table froze. The 3 capos stopped chewing. Don Severino blinked once. Then he rested his chin on his hand and answered slowly, Concedo, Signora Vasari, Signora Vasari. It was the first time he had called me that. I turned to the table. 4% al mese, I said, looking straight at the man with the thick ring, repeating the number I had read 3 nights earlier in the port ledger Kaysen left open on his desk when he thought I was asleep. È un numero preciso. Strano che lo sappia con tanta precisione, capo Bevilacqua, considerato che il libro del porto sta nell'ufficio di mio marito, e mio marito non lo apre da settembre. 4% a month. It's a precise number. Strange that you know it with such precision, capo Bevilacqua, considering the port ledger is in my husband's office, and my husband hasn't opened it since September. Bevilacqua, Rinaldo Bevilacqua, a name I had been cataloging for weeks, page by page along with the others, opened his mouth. He didn't speak. Forse il capo confonde il porto con la propria contabilità, I continued, in the same tone of someone commenting on the weather. Capita, alla nostra età. Perhaps the capo is confusing the port with his own bookkeeping. It happens at our age. Silence. Don Severino took his chin off his hand. Gioele Marchetti smiled for the first time since I had entered the Vasari mansion. Kaysen lifted his glass 3 centimeters, just 3, without a toast, without a word, and drank. Bevilacqua pushed back his chair, stood up, took his glass, empty, and walked out of the room with the gait of a man who had been insulted and knew he couldn't react at that table, not with that Don, not at that dinner. He stopped at the door, turned his head over his shoulder and looked at me. Straight, fixed, cold. He said nothing. He left. I didn't tremble. I trembled afterward. Kaysen called me into the hallway 20 minutes later. He was alone, in the chair, stopped beside the large portrait of his great-grandfather. I was coming from the pantry, still wearing the silk apron I had put on over the dress to serve. Choreography of mine, calculated, and he had understood it all from the first second. Meredith, I stopped. He held out his hand. Not to pull, just held out. I placed mine on top. Grazie, Regina. Thank you, Queen. I didn't answer. I couldn't. The floor of the Vasari mansion, which I had stepped onto in a wedding dress looking at the ceiling, in that second trembled in a way no earthquake would explain, and the worst of it all, was that I knew exactly who had made it tremble. I walked down the hallway. Behind me, I heard the chair start to move. I didn't look back, but I wanted to look, and that, in me, was new. Chapter 6. The Hand He Held to Walk. I called my mother on a Sunday morning. It was the first time in months. She answered on the second ring, with that hurry of someone who was still waiting, after everything, and her voice went small on the phone when I said without preamble, Mom, lunch today? There was a silence on the other end, a silence I recognized, because it was the same silence I myself had learned to make at the Vasari mansion when a word too big threatened to come out before its time. Then she answered, always, always, as if it had never stopped being always, even when I pretended it wasn't. I hung up and sat on the edge of the bed for a whole minute, the phone still warm in my palm, trying to understand why a 2-syllable word could weigh more than every designer dress hanging in the closet next door. I arrived at the Whitmore penthouse at noon. The elevator went up slowly, with that fine humming I had never noticed before. The hall I had walked through my whole life as if it were mine by right looked that afternoon like a borrowed place, the marble lighter than I remembered, the smell of lilies from my mother's greenhouse escaping the entryway vase, my grandfather's old clock striking the hours with the stubbornness of someone who hadn't yet been retired. And maybe that was the first thing I had learned at the Vasari mansion. Nothing we receive without asking for is, in fact, ours. My mother was waiting at the door. I hugged her before she had time to calculate. We stood in the hall, under the light coming through the skylight in long stripes, and her perfume, that perfume of vanilla and iron that was only hers, hit my nose and undid me inside. She didn't cry. I did, quietly into her shoulder, a short, dry cry that didn't resemble any of my old cries. When I pulled back, she ran her hand through my hair the way she used to when I was 7, and didn't yet know how to be cruel. Have you eaten? she asked. No. Come on. The three of us had lunch in the small dining room, the one she used when she didn't want to impress anyone. I spoke little. Ottavio spoke less. My mother started telling a story about the gardener and the neighbor's dog, stopped halfway, looked at me, and said without raising her voice, I don't know if I forgive you, Meredith. I'd like to know, but I don't yet. I swallowed. I didn't answer. Ottavio set down his fork, slowly. She picked the dog story back up as if nothing had happened, and the three of us laughed at last, a cracked laugh that took its time arriving. The sun came in through the open window, hit the pitcher of iced water and drew a trembling pool of light on the tablecloth. At coffee, my mother got up to ask for more cake. Ottavio stayed. He looked at me over the cup, the steam rising between his face and mine. You're different, daughter. I'm tired. No, different. I didn't answer. He set the cup down, reached his hand across the table and covered mine. His hand was colder than mine, and drier, the hand of a man who'd closed a deal before lunch. He said, without inflection, You're different, daughter. I always wanted to see you like this. Pause. He sipped the coffee. He added nothing more. I smiled too late, and the smile came out a little crooked. I went back to the Vasari mansion on Tuesday afternoon. I climbed onto the veranda without making a sound. In the garden, between the two wooden bars they had set up on the grass, Kaysen was trying to balance himself alone. No chair, no Tomas holding him. Tomas was 5 paces away, arms crossed, jaw clenched, obeying an order he hadn't liked receiving. Kaysen's white shirt clung to his shoulders. His forearms trembled. His chin lifted with the stubbornness of the boy he had been before the accident. I stopped. I didn't breathe. He let go of the bar with one hand, tried a step, and his leg gave out. He fell to his knees on the grass. Tomas took half a step forward. Kaysen raised his hand and Tomas stopped. He braced himself on the bar, pulled his body back up, slowly, and only then did he lift his eyes and see me on the veranda. His face changed the way it usually had been changing in the past weeks, when I walked into a room, a fraction of a second of relief before the control closed the gate again. Come here, he said. I went down the 3 veranda steps. The grass was cool under my soles, and the smell of jasmine from the bed by the wall arrived in short waves, depending on what the wind decided. I crossed the garden slowly. I stopped a meter from him, on the other side of the bars. Let go, I said. No, let go. He laughed, a short, nervous laugh, similar to mine. He took one hand off the bar. He held it out to me. I placed mine over his. His palm was warm, calloused from the wood, alive. Now the other one. Meredith, trust me. He let go. For a fraction of a second, he stood there alone, with both his hands held in mine, and the whole garden seemed to hold its breath along with us. Even the wind stopped in the wall's foliage. Then he took a step, then another. On the third, his left leg gave out, and he fell forward against me, and I held him as best I could. He was much heavier than me, and I stumbled, but I didn't let go. His chest hit mine, and for a second his scent, dry whiskey, mint soap, the clean fabric of the shirt, took me off the ground more than the weight did. Tomas began to approach. I raised my hand. He stopped. Again, I said. Kaysen laughed against my neck. The laugh vibrated inside my chest. You're cruel. I am. Stand up, Vasari. I hate you a little right now. Good. Enjoy the hate and stand up. He rose. He went back to the bars. He started again. On the 8th step, he stopped in the middle of the course, closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and went all the way to the end. When he finally stopped, sweating, out of breath, with his hands still in mine, he looked at me in a way no one had ever looked at me. Not my father, not my mother, not any of the boys at Voluto. It was the look of a man who had just walked holding someone else's hand for the first time in his adult life. Meredith, tell me, I wanted this marriage to be real from the night you came down the Voluto staircase. I froze. The wind moved a leaf on the lemon tree behind me and made a dry sound, offbeat. I accepted the contract because it was the only way to make you stay long enough to see me, he went on. If I'd shown up without it, you would have laughed in my face. I would have. I know. I looked down. At our hands joined on the wooden bar, his fingers laced into mine in a way that seemed like a decision, not a coincidence. Kaysen, tell me. I don't know who I was before you anymore. He let go of one of my hands. He raised his. He touched my face, his thumb passing slowly over the bone of my cheek, like someone testing the edge of something that can still break. He didn't kiss me. He just rested his forehead against mine. There, in the garden, with Tomas Drago staring up at the sky with such dedication it was almost funny. Good, he said, low. Me neither. That night, I went to his room. No one called me. There was no order. There was no ultimatum. There was no contract on the table. No key turning from outside the closet. I crossed the hallway barefoot, in the silk nightgown my mother had sent me as a gift a lifetime ago, feeling the cold floor under my feet and my heart beating in a place in my chest I didn't know I had. I stopped in front of his door exactly the way he had stopped in front of mine on our wedding night, only without a chair, without a wrist gripped, without a sentence of steel. I knocked once. He opened. He was standing, white shirt open at his chest, dark trousers, barefoot too. The warm light of the bedroom lamp drew a line around him, outlining his shoulder and going down his arm, and his eyes traveled down my body once and came back to my face without rushing. He looked at me. He didn't ask anything. He held out his hand. I took it. He pulled me inside with the gentleness of a man who had held weights much heavier than this, and even so chose, in that second, to be light. He leaned in. He kissed me. It was a single kiss, a kiss in the doorway, and from all the weeks the two of us had spent without telling each other the truth, the door closed. I woke up with the Chicago light slowly coming through the window, the white sheet wrapped around my body, his arm heavy across my waist, his face pressed to my shoulder, his breath deep against my neck, and the silence of the morning fitting around us as if it had been made to measure. Outside, the city had barely learned it was Monday. In here, time had decided to sit in the corner of the bed and wait. Kaysan was sleeping. The man the whole city feared, who served whiskey to old capos without a tremor in his hand, who had pinned me against the closet wall and told me he was still a man, vulnerable only there, on my shoulder, with his messy hair falling over his eyes and a small wrinkle between his brows, the kind that only appears on men who sleep distrusting their own sleep. I ran my fingers through his hair, slowly, without hurry. He let out a deep sigh, and the wrinkle smoothed away. I thought about Veludo, about the silver dress, about the I do to the ceiling, about the sentence in the closet, about the night in the bathroom, about the kiss at physical therapy, about the again, about the capo's dinner, about yesterday afternoon in the garden, the third step, the leg that gave out, his weight falling against me and my simple decision not to let go. I thought about my mother, about the hug in the hall, about the perfume of vanilla and iron. I thought about Ottavio, his hand covering mine across the lunch table, and the sentence he had said, "I always wanted to see you like this, daughter." And for the briefest second, a thought crossed me that didn't quite become a question. Why, after all, did he accept everything so quickly? The idea passed. It didn't weigh. It cast no shadow. It was a tiny comma at the end of a yes, and the yes was too big to be interrupted by a comma. I nestled into his chest. He murmured something in Italian, sleeping, and pulled me closer without waking. The wheelchair was in the corner of the room, empty. The contract was in the desk drawer, forgotten. The Cosa Nostra obeyed. The city slept. And I, for the first time in my life, had wanted something that didn't belong to me by right of last name, and had been chosen back. I closed my eyes. We were together. We were at peace. And that was all. Lena here. That wraps up book 1, and I've already finished book 2. You can get access to it for a really small fee. I thought Kaysan Vasari had chosen me after everything we'd been through. 6 months later, he was no longer trapped in that wheelchair, body destroyed, pride in tatters, when I was the only one who stayed, the one who wiped the fever sweat from him in the middle of the night, the one who lied to the whole Cosa Nostra saying the dawn was still strong while he cried in pain against my chest. I rebuilt him, with my hands, with my body, with my whole soul, and he looked at me as if I were the only light left in the darkness. I almost believed it was love, until he walked again, until the nights he went out without explanation and came back smelling of expensive perfume, until the redhead from Veluto, wrong hands and wrong glances, biased ones. I thought it was just jealousy, that I was going crazy. So I started investigating, and what I found was worse than any affair. My father and my husband had set the whole thing up. The club, the marriage, the yes that came too fast. Maybe I had been used only to put Kaysan back on the throne, while he couldn't even stand on his own. I served. I cared for him like a slave in love. Now that he had legs, power, money, and a harem of beautiful, disposable women waiting at the club, I had become inconvenient. And I, who had once held the monster in my arms while he shook in pain, now watched his hand slide toward the holster as he said quietly, "You know too much for me to just let you walk away, so..." Like I said, that was just a taste of book 2. To watch it uncensored, just click on the first link here in the pinned comment. I'll see you on the other side in a few seconds. Remember, just click on the first link down here in the comments, and Book 2 complete, no ads, no interruptions, will already be available for you. It's very simple. Book 2 is something I'm loving making. You're loving it too, so I promise there will be more. It's where you find increasingly spicy stories, a true dark romance. And precisely because this version is getting more and more heated, the video isn't well accepted publicly on YouTube. This closed environment is where I can actually share my essence and where I feel free to do my best work for you. More news coming soon. I'll be waiting for you on the other side. Congratulations! Your purchase has been confirmed, and you now have full access to books 1 and 2 of all our stories, completely ad-free and uninterrupted. Everything is available on the My Stories platform, from mafia romance and billionaire romance to our spicier tales. This content is ready for you now, with new episodes added daily. Access is simple. Just log in using the same email address you used for your purchase. A confirmation has also been sent to that same email. The My Stories platform is very simple and intuitive. Each image represents a story. If it has a book 2, just click and press play. Everything is already unlocked for you. You can also rate each story, leave a like, and write a comment. Your feedback will be visible to all our other subscribers. This is our romance universe, so please feel free to interact. From this moment on, this is officially your home for romance stories.